you ever noticed how easy it is for us to focus on the urgent? When I mean urgent, I mean the things that just hit you in the face, the things that you have to deal with because they're right in front of you. Whether that's your baby's diaper's full and so you got to go change it, that's urgent. Whether your child is sick, it's urgent. You know, for sometimes in my life, I'm running home because soccer practice starts in 30 minutes and we don't want to be late. It's urgent. You know, we find ourselves running from thing to thing and just having to deal with the life things that just come at us. As we consider parenting, as we consider the role that God has given us to lead our children, our teenagers, intentionally to the things of God, we have to ask ourselves, are we living in the urgent or are we focusing in on the pertinent? You know, the research shows us the number one reason parents don't intentionally lead and invest spiritually in the life of their child or their teenager is time. And it completely makes sense, right? So how do we do this? How do we respond to this? I want to offer you a perspective that I think might help as we consider leading our children spiritually. And it's this, that our children are not just our gift for this life, but they are God's gift for eternity. In other words, this, God has created your child as an eternal being. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, the first part, it lists all sorts of activities, all sorts of occasions, and that there's a time for every occasion, every activity. And in verse 11, the writer says this, He has made everything appropriate in its time. But then he says this, He has also put eternity in their hearts. So your son, your daughter, and yourself as well, in your heart, God has put eternity. Meaning this, that our perspective, there's something infused within us that loves, that longs for, that wants, that craves the eternal. But what happens is the voices and the noise of the activity and the urgent in the flesh begins to drown out that eternal perspective that God has planted within us. We live in a culture and we are a people that says do more, accomplish more, achieve more, chase after more. And we find ourselves missing what God has as pertinent for us as parents. Timothy Paul Jones, he's a writer. He's an incredible author who's written many books. And he said this. He said, if children were nothing more than a gift for this life, a single-minded focus on children's happiness and success might make sense. If children were for a gift for this life only, maybe it would make sense to raise them with calendars that are full, but souls that are empty. Captives of the deadly delusion that their value depends on what they accomplish here and now. And when I read that, man, that cut to the very core of who I am. Because it begs the question, am I more, do I care more about the value of my children being successful in their activities here on this earth? Or do I care more about their eternal soul? So how do we think through this? Let me offer you two things. Number one is this. Remember that we aren't promised tomorrow. We aren't promised tomorrow. And I don't know that I necessarily have to remind you of that. We are living in a time where this virus, where it's changed our perspective a little bit. But look at what James chapter 4 says in verse 13. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will travel to such and such a city and spend a year there and do business and make a profit. In other words, we lived in a time and we live in a time, and I think in the future we'll get back to, where we make plans and we go and we do and we want to accomplish and we want to achieve. We want to be successful. We want to do these things. But in verse 14, James writes this, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring, what your life will be. For you are like vapor that appears for a little while, then vanishes. So as we think about how we raise our children, we need to understand that the pursuits of this earth and this life here on earth only are like a vapor. They don't last. They're going to be gone. Jesus said, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world yet loses his soul? And so we have to remember that we aren't promised tomorrow. Number two, we need to remember to invest in what lasts. Invest in what lasts. I don't think anybody wants to invest in something that's going to be gone tomorrow. You know, in Psalms chapter 78, the psalmist writes this: He established a testimony in Jacob and set up a law in Israel. In other words, God has given us his commands. He's given us his word. Why? And he commanded our fathers to teach to their children. So there it is again. The role of the parent, the role of the father especially, is to teach their children the things of God, the ways of God, the commands of God. But notice the next verse as to why God set it up this way. Watch this. So that a future generation, children yet to be born, might know. That they will rise and tell their children, that they might put their confidence in God and not forget God's works, but keep his commands. So if we're going to invest in what lasts, we need to think through this perspective that our teaching of our children, the investing of the spiritual things in the heart and the life of our children is not just for them. And if it was for them, that would be enough, but it's bigger than that. Don't miss this. He says it's for a future generation, children yet to be born. So when we invest in the life of our child, in the life of our teenager, you are actually investing in the life of your grandchild and your great-grandchild as well. So there's a perspective that God gives us to help us understand that we as eternal beings need to invest in that. And it's not just for what we see in the here and now. It is for generations and generations to come. So as we think through this perspective, the danger, though, is to think, well, fine, we aren't going to do any extracurricular activities. We're not going to do sports. We're not going to train. We're not going to be competitive in what we're going to do. We're just going to read the Bible. We're just going to go to church. That's it. We're going to be nuns and monks. And that's not at all what God's trying to tell us. What I think he wants us to do is to live our lives in this world to be transformed by him and his word through an eternal perspective, being the filter and the lens through which we do what we do. Well, what do I mean by that? See, God has not called us to segment our faith from reality. Our faith is to infuse into every single thing that we do. It's to be lived out in our whole life on this earth, meaning that we prioritize the eternal by training our children to have that perspective in what they do. So, understanding that God wants to use your children's talents and gifts and passions for his glory. You know, when I was a child, I played tennis, and I had some success in that. And I'll never forget when I was younger, my parents taught me this, and it didn't really make sense to me, but they said this: God has given you the ability to play tennis well. You need to use that for him. I was like, what does that mean? How do you use tennis for God? Like, you're hitting a tennis ball. And what my parents were training me to understand is that my success on a tennis court was not for my own achievement. It was not for my own satisfaction, and it was not to give myself a self-esteem. My success on a tennis court was to be pointing to God and what he wanted to accomplish in me and through me. You know, it's interesting that if we shift our perspective, God begins to open doors for us in ways that we never would have seen before. I found myself on a tennis team in college with people from 7 different countries and an opportunity to live out a Christ-honoring life before them and begin to tell them about the grace and the forgiveness and the goodness of who God is. God used me in a missional way through my tennis. I had the opportunity to lead children in tennis camps and proclaim the gospel through Bible studies at a retreat center, at a camp. And if I had not pursued tennis, I would not have had those gospel kingdom opportunities. So God wants us to pursue excellence in all that we do, but we need to infuse a faith. Watch this. He says, you teach them so that they can put their confidence in God what happens is when we start pursuing the things of this earth and the urgent and the activity, we find ourselves putting our confidence in our ability, in our skill, in our achievement, and all the things that we do rather than God. But what the perspective we need is an eternal perspective where our children have a confidence in God, in who God made them, and then out of that, using the gifts, using the abilities for His purpose and for His kingdom. You know, as we consider this, I want to close with this question. When our life is over as parents, when we leave this earth, and our children and our grandchildren and our great-children are left, what is it that we have left with them? What's the perspective? What's the emphasis? What is it that they're going to be pursuing because of the way that we led them and we taught them and we modeled for them? God has put within us eternity in our hearts, a perspective for His kingdom and to make His kingdom known in all that we do.